With the 11th pick in the 2004 NFL Draft, the Pittsburgh Steelers select Ben Roethlisberger, quarterback, University of Miami, Ohio.
And the Pittsburgh Steelers become the first franchise in history to win 6 Super Bowls.
But on that final drive, what did you say to these guys when you got them up? I said it's now or never, but anything's possible.
Out of control. It's going to be everything. That's going to be suspension, fine.
Broncos and Patriots are going to battle for the AFC Championship next Sunday here in Denver.
Well, they got a really good football team. No glaring weakness in the Patriots, that's for sure.
It's over. The Jacksonville Jaguars have pulled off the upset of the playoffs.
Well, I know it's the cliche of cliches. Nothing lasts forever.
But they do not have one, and Ben Neiman makes the tackle there, so it is over.
I do want to hit Ben Roethlisberger here, retiring after 18 years in the NFL, and the Steelers love him forever. Good luck to who's next.
Who is going to answer
Great question.
18 straight years of winning seasons?
Don't know.
Jeremy Fowler reported as Mitch Trubisky texted me, he's going to be signing with the Pittsburgh Steelers.
The Pittsburgh Steelers select Kenny Pickett.
Okay.
Quarterback, Pittsburgh.
Time runs out. The Bills advance. They win in the wild card round for the 4th consecutive year.
Steeler Nation just signed, baby. Fired up to wear the black and gold. Here we go.
Justin Fields is the newest member of the Pittsburgh Steelers.
The way the Ravens got out of the game, they had a plan, they were able to execute, they kept the crowd in it, they attacked the team that had lost 4 in a row. Pittsburgh was lifeless.
Say what you're saying.
Purgatory! Y'all in purgatory, y'all stuck, limbo!
I think the Steelers are in the worst spot in sports. Good enough to make the postseason, but not enough to ever win. Not bad enough to draft a stud quarterback, not good enough to win with a veteran cast off.
3,000 days since they have won a playoff game. Yes! Steelers have gone almost 3,000 days, Herbie!
The Pittsburgh Steelers just signed Aaron Rodgers. Would have been something exciting to hear about 3 years ago. Closer to Rodgers' prime, right after Big Ben retired, fans would have been lining up to place bets on them to win the AFC and even the Super Bowl. But now, nobody cares. Since Aaron Rodgers is 41 and didn't look great on the Jets last year after suffering a torn Achilles the year before. In fact, this team has added a different QB what feels like every offseason for the past few years, and no one has truly gotten excited about it in a while. At least with Ben, they felt like they had something, but he's been gone for a while. First-round picks like Kenny Pickett, more talented but struggling young QBs like Justin Fields, Mitch Trubisky, and even former Super Bowl champs like Russell Wilson. No one has cared. But the Steelers, not even recently, but for years, have never been a bad team. Their head coach Mike Tomlin has had a winning record for 17 seasons in a row, backed by his defense and culture, even in the years beyond Big Ben. Since they are a good team, how have they not been able to position themselves to get their guy by any means necessary to give themselves a shot? All the other teams that owned QBs from the old era have since replaced their guy once or even twice. The Patriots tried replacing Brady with Mac Jones, but think they have it right now with Drake May. The Packers replaced Rodgers with Jordan Love, far in advance and much to the dismay of Rodgers, but that worked out well too. The Chargers replaced Phillip Rivers with Justin Herbert. The Falcons eventually replaced Matt Ryan with Kirk Cousins and then Michael Penix. The Giants tried replacing Eli Manning with Daniel Jones and are now on to Jackson Dart, but they've had major issues outside of the QB room holding them back as well. Joe Flacco with Lamar, Tony Romo with Dak, Cam being replaced by Bryce Young, the list goes on. There's still a few other teams like the Saints struggling to find their next Drew Brees, but most of the other teams looking for a quarterback haven't had a great one in a long time. So what gives with the Steelers? one of the greatest organizations in football is left still looking for the most important position 4 years later, and likely will still be looking for one the following season. Why can't they get this right? I wonder what opportunities they've missed over the years, hindsight being 2020, and what was genuinely a mistake that they made along the way. To do that, we got to go back to 2004. In the 2004 NFL Draft, there were 3 QBs listed near the top. While the Giants and Chargers were fighting over who was going to get Eli Manning and who was going to get Phillip Rivers, the Steelers gladly selected Ben Roethlisberger 11th overall without having to move a muscle. Roethlisberger inherited a great team, and although he wasn't a big part of the offense, in his second season he was able to do enough to get to the Super Bowl, where the Hall of Fame wide receiver Hines Ward won the MVP in a 21-10 game versus the Seahawks. This would only be the beginning, though. They finished 8-8 the next year, and the Steelers' legendary coach Bill Cowherd retired and was replaced by a man we all know today, a 35-year-old Mike Tomlin. In 2007, the Steelers would make the playoffs in Tomlin's first year, but lose in the wild card round. A nice start to the new regime, but nothing could compare to the next season in 2008. The Steelers went 12-4 and landed the number 2 seed in the AFC. Big Ben was solid through the playoffs, but the defense and run game got them to the Super Bowl. In the Super Bowl, jaw-dropping plays by James Harrison before half in the form of a 100-yard pick six as time expired, and a pair of touchdowns from Larry Fitzgerald in the second half left this game at a score of 20-23 Cardinals, with only 2 minutes and 37 seconds left on the clock, and 0 passing touchdowns to show for it on the Steelers' end. But Ben Roethlisberger began a decent drive. With just a minute left to go, he was able to get to the Cardinals' 46-yard line, and on 2nd and 6, the Cardinals rushed 5. Ben pump fakes it deep and then hits Santonio Holmes inside, who is wide open. He runs it all the way down to the Cardinals' 6-yard line. What a great pump fake by Ben Roethlisberger to back off that safety from Santonio Holmes, giving him the separation to get all those yards after the catch. He made that play happen just as much as Santonio Holmes did. And then Mike Tomlin called them a timeout. The Steelers would line up 5 wide. Ben takes the snap and he pumps again, and then he throws it to the left corner to Holmes, and it is high and through the hands. What a crushing incompletion as you're in position to make the scoring play for the win, and it's incomplete. The pressure was on. They line up again in 2-by-2. Big Ben motions Hines Ward inside and then takes the snap. The pressure comes through, but the offensive line is able to contain it. He's stuck in the pocket, and now he has to throw, which he does in the corner, out of bounds, over 3 defenders' heads, where only Holmes can catch it, which he does and drags his toes at full extension. What a dime. As Santonio Holmes hugs the ball he thought he lost the chance to catch for the win, and the Steelers go home Super Bowl champions. This moment was the modern-day Steelers' crowning achievement, made possible by a throw made by their quarterback, who wasn't having his best game, but was clutch when it mattered the most. This is what every franchise wants when they draft or acquire a quarterback, whether they're the most talented or not, young or old. They had Big Ben and Mike Tomlin for the next 14 seasons, and somehow they never pieced it together again. They had some great eras. They made it back again in 2010, but fell to Aaron Rodgers' Green Bay Packers in the Super Bowl. Following that, from 2012 to 2021, when Big Ben retired, they would make the playoffs 6 of 10 times, never finishing with a record below 500. Despite the greatness of the Killer Bee era, the Steelers couldn't even make it back to the Super Bowl. Their 2 best chances were stifled by Vontaze Burfict knocking out Antonio Brown in the 2015-2016 playoffs, and then the Steelers falling to the Broncos in the divisional round. And then, in 2017, they fell short in a shootout to the Jacksonville Jaguars. As Big Ben approached 40, the ceiling for the offense fell off, and the team didn't have what it needed anymore. Ben retired after the 2021 season, and the search for the next Steelers quarterback began here. In Ben's last year, They added Mason Rudolph and Duck Hodges, and Dwayne Haskins in 2021, and Mitch Trubisky after Ben retired. I thought they were both good adds, especially Haskins, a former first-round pick who had some talent and was truly set up to fail by the team that had drafted him. But tragically, he passed away, leaving the NFL in complete shock. And I want to take a moment to recognize just how tragic this was, because he had a year to develop behind Ben Roethlisberger. He was on a much better team than he's ever been on, and I thought he was going to be their future QB. So rest in peace to Dwayne Haskins. The NFL will never forget you. The Steelers, left in shock and needing a new plan to replace Big Ben. Unfortunately for them, they were picking 20th overall, and they were out of reach of the top QBs in a usual class. But this was no ordinary QB class. This was the Kenny Pickett, Desmond Ridder, Malik Willis, Matt Corral, Bailey Zappi, Sam Howell, and Brock Purdy class. Actually, some decent guys here considering some of the value, but most of them were backups for one reason or another. Purdy has shown in the 49ers scheme to be very efficient. Malik Willis, he did win some games with the Packers last year. Sam Howell proved to be a volatile backup on the Commanders, and the rest are decent backups, but Kenny Pickett was considered to be the best QB on the board. It turned out a little better than expected, but it's considered to be one of the worst classes we've seen since 2013 or maybe even later. Regardless, the Steelers needed a plan at QB to add to Trubisky and Rudolph. So when the 2022 draft rolled around, 20 was the expected starting point for drafting QBs in the first round instead of the usual first overall or top 5, as elite defensive prospects guarded the top of the draft. The discussion was whether they would go for Pickett, a more pro-ready guy, or Malik Willis and shoot for the upside, which, honestly, with Trubisky at the helm, wouldn't have been that bad to give him room to develop. But what sort of sealed it was Kenny Pickett played his college ball at Pittsburgh. It was written on the wall. They were going to take him, and they did. I had mixed feelings about the pick, but overall it was hard to argue with. Pittsburgh had a good roster already. They could try to stay competitive and hope Pickett develops in the best way. I typically ping myself as one who prefers teams to go for ceiling no matter what. So perhaps taking an offensive lineman than Malik Willis in the second or third round could have been a better process, but let's just see how things turned out. The Steelers began starting the 2022 season with Mitch Trubisky. Their offense wasn't what it used to be. The Killer Bee era was long gone. The offensive line had some turnover, and the young cast of weapons was Deontay Johnson, rookie George Pickens, and Chase Claypool, Najee Harris at running back, along with rookie Jalen Warren, and then at tight end, Pat Freiermuth and Zach Gentry. The defense was still solid, but had some weaknesses in the secondary. Overall, the offense was just very new, and with a new young QB as well, this was the beginning of the new era. The first 3 weeks with Trubisky were rough. They won their first game against the Bengals in a crazy overtime game, but they would lose the next 2 games to the Patriots and Browns. They turned to Pickett as a starter, and the offense looked more or less the same in a loss to the Jets 24-20, still failing to score more than 20 points since week 1. Things would get worse the following week in a blowout loss to the Bills, and then in the next week, Pickett getting concussed versus the Buccaneers. Trubisky did step in and secure the win in that game, but the team would defer back to Pickett. Over the next 6 games, Pittsburgh would go 3-3, and although Pickett wasn't playing great, he was starting to piece together some wins. Following in Week 14 versus the Ravens, Pickett would suffer another concussion. Trubisky would fill in, but to no avail this time. The Steelers were 5-8 and looking like they were going to have their first losing season. But Trubisky picked up a win against the Panthers and kept things alive. And then Pickett stepped back in and ripped off 3 straight wins on the back of his defense against the Ravens, the Raiders, and the Browns, finishing 9-8. They did miss the playoffs, but the 500 streak continues. But what did it cost? The Steelers had a positive season, but the offense especially needed help. They scored more than 20 points just 5 times, more than 23 just 4 times, and more than 24 just twice. The Steelers still had confidence in their defense, but between Pickett and Matt Canada, the offensive coordinator, there was no confidence in the offense. Pickett finished the season playing in 13 games, combining for 2,641 yards, 10 total touchdowns, and 9 turnovers. On the other hand, some blamed Canada's bland play calling and poor offensive line play, stunting the young QB's development. It was becoming clear that if things didn't turn around, one of them were going to get the axe. And they also had the 17th overall pick in a much better QB class, featuring guys like Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, Anthony Richardson, and Will Levis. Just out of reach of the top 3 guys and already owning a young QB, it seemed the timing wasn't right for any of these guys. They were too far away to trade up, and they had other needs to fill. But they also weren't that confident in Pickett either, so now they're in a weird spot. So the only other option was to focus on the offensive line, which they did. They traded up to 14 and selected offensive tackle Broderick Jones. They would trade up again to 32 to select cornerback Joey Porter Jr., son of former Steelers linebacker Joey Porter. They definitely needed Joey Porter Jr., and the defensive players that they got were all good, but they clearly needed more help on the offensive side. So they entered 2023 with a very similar situation, and the results weren't much better. Over the first 7 weeks, the Steelers did go 4-2 and have their bye week. However, the 2 losses they suffered were complete blowouts to the Super Bowl-bound 49ers and the breakout Houston Texans. And week 8 against the Jaguars, Pickett would get knocked out of the game with a rib injury, and Trubisky would fail to recover the win. The Steelers fall to 4-3. They pulled off some nice wins the next 2 games against the Titans and Packers, but following that, they would suffer an abysmal loss to the Browns, 13-10. And the fans were shouting, "Fire Canada," for weeks now. Something had to give. 2 days later, November 21st in 2023, the Pittsburgh Steelers made a move that they hadn't made in over 80 years. They fired their offensive coordinator, Matt Canada, in season, elevating running backs coach Eddie Faulkner to play calling duties. And the results were better. Although they only won 16-10 versus the Bengals the next week, the offense was moving the ball and controlling the clock. Kenny Pickett had 278 passing yards and a 72.7% completion percentage. And this was just the first game. Maybe Pickett really could develop into a more explosive QB. However, you can't make it up. The next week versus the Cardinals, Pickett suffered a high ankle sprain, ending his season. You've got to be kidding me. It certainly helped firing Canada, but I think after that, we all realized it wasn't just Canada or Pickett who was the problem. It was both of them. Canada had awful play calling, but Pickett was limited compared to other QBs already when it came to arm talent, and that constrains your playbook. Even if he could develop, he now has suffered 2 injuries in every season, and it seemed like he wasn't built to absorb the hits and sacks behind that offensive line. Trubisky would go 0-3, failing to eclipse 200 yards in any of those games, and the Steelers were 7-7. They would turn to Mason Rudolph, who surprisingly went 3-0 to finish the season and eclipsed 270 passing yards twice. They made the playoffs, but then they were pancaked by the Bills, 31-17. What a circus. The Steelers had seen enough, and they would trade Kenny Pickett to the Eagles that offseason for a 4th-round pick. Now with Mason Rudolph testing free agency and Trubisky moving on, the Steelers were starting from scratch again. Also picking 20th overall, again out of reach of quarterback and in the wrong class, this was the most loaded QB class we've seen in a long time. Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, Drake May, J.J. McCarthy, Bo Nix, and Michael Penix were all touted as first-round talents, and most near the top. However, it was expected that all of, if not one, would be taken before the 20th pick as draft day approached. The Steelers would need to make some moves pre-draft to address this situation. On March 15th, they agreed to terms with Russell Wilson, and then the very next day they traded a 6th-round pick for Justin Fields. This actually seemed like a much better plan to me. Both were not long-term commitments, and you had a young developing quarterback and then an older veteran guy in Russell Wilson for some stability. It was a better plan, but missing out on this QB class was still such a shame. The Steelers stayed put, missed out on all the QBs, and they did select a tackle to pair with Broderick Jones in Troy Fautanu, and then they followed that up, drafting center Zach Frazier in the 2nd round, and Roman Wilson, wide receiver, in the 3rd round. Seemed like they finally had the core pieces to their offensive line, and they were really trying to add weapons to replace busts like Chase Claypool and problems like Deontay Johnson. The Steelers had a new look. Fields would start the season as Russell Wilson was dealing with a nagging calf injury from training camp. You still had Najee and Warren, but now Pickens is your number 1, Calvin Austin is your number 2, and then Roman Wilson, the rookie, is your number 3. You had the same tight ends, a seemingly upgraded offensive line, and the same defense. So the thought was, with improved quarterback play, Canada out of the picture for good now, that things could finally start looking better. And to start things off, Fields, through the first 6 weeks, had about 1,400 total yards, 10 touchdowns, and only 1 turnover, which was an interception. 5 of those touchdowns came on the ground as the Steelers did a decent job catering to his skill set. But with a 4-2 record and a somewhat struggling passing offense, the Steelers did not see the vision. As Russell Wilson reached 100%, they stayed true to their word, promising him the starting spot, and pulled Fields. Initially, this looked like a great idea. Russell Wilson and the Steelers went 5-0, and he scored 26 or more points in the first 4 games, scoring over 32 twice, all because of how his deep ball opened up the offense. Even taking down the Baltimore Ravens in a defensive showdown, he was providing Pittsburgh with the best quarterback play they've seen since before Big Ben's fall-off. Things were looking good. However, on a snowy Thursday night in Cleveland, the Steelers would face off against Jameis Winston's Browns after he made a legendary pregame speech, and that is not a Jameis Winston you want to go against. The elements caused turnovers for both sides, and ultimately the Browns came out on top. Not the end of the world, but what's worse is Russell Wilson was beat up pretty bad in this game. He did not have a listed injury from this game, but I suspect he had some rough bruising and perhaps a re-aggravation of that calf injury. He was listed on the next week as a veteran rest day on the practice report before exploding against the Bengals the following week. But after that, the wheels completely fell off. And this is all speculation, but just look at these hits that he was taking and the regression the offense showed the following weeks against tougher defenses. They would defeat the Browns after the Bengals game, but following that, they would finish the season against the Eagles, Ravens, Chiefs, and Bengals, going 0-4. Dropping from 10-3 to 10-7. And then they would face off against the Ravens again in the wild card round, and they were no match for the Ravens' explosive offense. The Steelers simply ran out of gas. They failed to retain either Justin Fields or Russell Wilson, somewhat willingly, looking for something new again. In another weak quarterback class, however, they looked towards free agency and had their eyes on Aaron Rodgers, who likes to take his time with this sort of thing. So fast forward to the draft, where they did select a quarterback, but much later this time. In the 6th round, they go with Will Howard, national champion out of Ohio State, who had a raw but gifted skill set. Just before mandatory minicamp, Aaron Rodgers finally put pen to paper, and now we are here. The Steelers are entering the 2025-2026 season with hope for this year, but the same question beyond that. Who will be the quarterback of the future? Will Howard is adamant that he will be the guy, and he has the talent to do it. His prospect profile describes him as such. A tough player with good mobility and arm strength, but struggles processing a whole defense. I'm not going to openly doubt him learning behind Aaron Rodgers, but it's not a great plan to just bank on him alone. Chances are they're going to select another quarterback in the 2026 draft after Rodgers retires. So instead of trying to project how this is going to play out in the years beyond this, I want to diagnose why the Steelers are in this situation. Purgatory. Purgatory is typically a word used to describe an average quarterback. That is not good enough to win a Super Bowl without a top 3 roster, but not bad enough to justify moving on from him. I feel the same idea can be used to describe the Steelers as a whole. And instead of moving on from a quarterback or sticking with him, it's about the structure of the team, retaining certain players, retaining cap space or spending it, and draft capital. This is the to tank or not to tank discussion, and also planning ahead while Big Ben was still there. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, the Packers showed us the first way you can address an aging quarterback. You get ahead of it. Love was drafted in the 2020 draft with the 26th pick and sat for 3 years developing behind Aaron Rodgers, and it clearly worked out well for the Packers as they're back in the playoffs. The 17th pick the Steelers owned was traded for Minkah Fitzpatrick, a great player that's earned his paycheck in Pittsburgh, but you just wonder how things could have been if they had the opportunity to draft Love and let him sit behind Big Ben for 2 years. In the same draft in the second round, they selected Chase Claypool, 49th overall, a talented player that ultimately busted and was traded away. Just 4 picks later, the Eagles selected Jalen Hurts to sit behind Wentz, and that obviously worked out in the best way possible for them. I do give Hurts a hard time, but I believe he would have fit right in Pittsburgh, had even more time to grow before his time to start had arrived, so I think it would have been a good pick. In 2021, Ben's last year, during that draft, they felt they needed to go all in for Big Ben, similar to the Giants with Saquon and Eli, and selected Najee Harris in the first round, 24th overall. All the top QBs were off the board, and neither Trevor Lawrence, Zach Wilson, or Justin Fields have exceeded expectations, so I'd say they get a pass for this one. We also know they added guys like Dwayne Haskins, so I actually think they were thinking ahead here, which is, again, why it is so tragic that we lost Dwayne Haskins. We broke down the 2022 season and how they were backed into a corner here, but to me, this defined the moment that the Steelers chose their path, refusing to settle for a potentially losing season by entering the year with Mitch Trubisky and building up the team. Taking Pickett let it be known that they were not going to essentially tank. They wanted to keep winning and hope their lesser talent of a quarterback in Pickett could develop into a Super Bowl caliber quarterback. I understand if he was closer to a Bo Nix level guy, but if that was the case, he would not have still been available at 20 when no QBs were taken yet. We know this didn't work out. We can see the fallout now. They kept having average seasons, holding them out of draft position, and even with the bad QB play. It wouldn't have been like the Steelers to settle for Trubisky for a year, but they would have had another first-round player on the roster contributing, and the ability to easily move on from Trubisky in the next few classes where guys like Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, and Anthony Richardson were available, the legendary 6 quarterback class the following year. Sticking with Trubisky would have given them flexibility and draft position to trade up in 2022, or better yet, trade back and build up your picks so that the following year you can use those picks to trade up. That's the long game of rebuilding and addressing a quarterback problem. Something the Steelers organization was not willing to put up with. Well, let's look at things now. I hope Aaron Rodgers can have a great season. I'm not saying it's going to be impossible for them to make the Super Bowl, but if I had to bet, I'd say their ceiling is divisional round losers. I just don't see enough support on the offense or consistency from their defense the past few years to go bar for bar with the other 3 elite AFC teams that they will inevitably face off against in the divisional round. And for Will Howard, like I explained, he's got to develop, and we likely won't know until 2026 if he's good, unless Aaron Rodgers gets hurt. So what am I suggesting? After this season, the Steelers must let go of their pride and reset somehow to escape this purgatory. Whether it's trading back in or trading up, they need to do something next year that either gets them a quarterback with elite skills that can elevate the offense, or do something that sets them up for the future to move up and to do that. But the worst thing they can do is just sit tight at 20 or wherever they're going to end up picking and select an average prospect that will fail to elevate this offense, or sign some free agent guy who was abandoned for a reason. I think this is also something that happens with defensive coaches like Tomlin, as they want to believe the defense can carry them, which it can, as long as the offense is reliable, which it hasn't been for over 5 years. An offensive coach is much more likely to be patient, to deal with a losing season if he knows that he's going to get his quarterback of the future for the offense he wants. Overall, though, I'd say things could be a lot worse. When you don't have a roster either, it sucks. Just ask me how it's been being a Giants fan the last decade. But just because you're better than some of the worst teams in the league situationally doesn't mean you're doing it right either. There are 31 different paths to failure each season in the NFL, and the Steelers have been stuck in the same one since Big Ben left. And I'm a Giants fan, but I've always sort of rooted for the Steelers. That Super Bowl versus the Cardinals was the first football game I ever remember watching at just 8 years old with my family. I gained consciousness. as James Harrison and Larry Fitzgerald went back and forth across the span of the field, and as Big Ben and Santonio Holmes sealed the deal with one of the greatest pitching catches ever made. So I'm hoping the Steelers can figure this out after Rodgers retires. As much as it holds them back too, I feel like they're the last team in the NFL that still plays like it's 2008, and I really do appreciate that. So we will have to wait an entire year to see how this story continues to develop, but in the meantime, we get to see if Aaron Rodgers has one more left in him.
Yeah, you know what it is. Black and yellow, black and